Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to today's conversation about the election in Saarland. Voters in 4 German states will take to the polls this year, and these elections are seen as an important test for the new government in Berlin and also for the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, which is struggling to make a comeback after its defeat in the federal election last September. The first state to vote is Saarland this Sunday, March 27th. It will be followed by elections in Schleswig-Holstein and North Rhine-Westphalia in May, and also in Lower Saxony in October. Each of these states is very different, and there are different factors at play. Saarland is a pretty small state, it's fair to say. It's on the border of France and Luxembourg, but Sunday's election carries an important symbolic value. The CDU has governed in the state since 1999, but it's trailing the SPD in polls by about 10%, even more in some of the recent polls that I've seen. I'm joined today by Dr. Daniel Kirch. He has been with the Saarbrücker Zeitung since 2010 and has served as the paper's chief correspondent for state politics since 2016. Daniel, herzlich willkommen. It's great to have you with us today.
Vielen Dank. It's great to be with you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, Daniel, I thought we could maybe start by just talking about the political landscape in Saarland. As I mentioned briefly, traditionally, this state has been led by the CDU. There's been a grand coalition in place since 2012. It was led first by Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, who I think many people in the US are familiar with, until she stepped down to assume the role of General Secretary of the Christian Democratic Union. And her successor, who's still the Minister President, is Tobias Hans. So perhaps you can share with us a little bit your take about Saarland and what some of the overarching political trends are.
Yeah, the political landscape of the Saarland is very special and unique, I would say. Saarland is a very small state with nearly 1 million inhabitants. So this is about like Delaware or Montana. But despite that, it had, at least in the past, it had large impact on national politics. In the government of Chancellor Merkel, 3 important ministries were held by politicians from the Saarland. You may remember them. For example, Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, called AKK, was previously the Prime Minister of the Saarland until 2018. Foreign Minister Heiko Maas was the Deputy Prime Minister of the Saarland until 2014. And also the former Minister of Economic Affairs in the Merkel administration, Peter Altmaier, is also from the Saarland. So let me go a little bit into history so that you have a better understanding of the political landscape. After the Second World War, the Saarland was led by the Christian Democrats until 1985. 40 years of CDU government in the Saarland. The reason for that is that the Saarland is a very Catholic state, the most Catholic state in Germany, even more Catholic than Bavaria. But at the same time, the Saarland has also a strong industry and very powerful labor unions. And that's why center-left parties always have good chances to win elections, especially because religion has lost much of its influence on voting behavior in the last 3 or 4 decades. Now, given this situation, why has the CDU then been governing the state for more than 20 years? That's quite simple, because the reason is that many traditional social democrat voters were frustrated about the free market policy and the cut of social services by the SPD-led federal government under Chancellor Schröder 20 years ago. Many of these voters did not participate anymore in the following elections, And even in 2007, a new left party was founded, the so-called The Left, which was quite attractive to former SPD voters, especially in the Saarland, because this new party was founded and led by the former Saarland Prime Minister Oskar Lafontaine, who is still very popular. And he got in the state elections in 2009, he got more than 20% of the votes in the Saarland, which was very sensational. He built this party together with the former Communist Party PDS, the former Eastern Communist Party, and built the new party, The Left. So this was of strategic advantage for the CDU, because the former social democratic voters now split on two different left parties, the SPD and the Left. And that is the reason why the CDU could remain the strongest party in the Saarland. It was not own strength, but the fact that the left voter potential split up onto two different parties. In 2012, then Prime Minister AKK built a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. And of course, this grand coalition was also kind of result of the overwhelming financial and economic problems of the Saarland. In 2018, AKK gave up this position, and she went to Berlin to become the national chairwoman of the CDU and later on the defense minister. And she was succeeded by Tobias Hans, who was at that time the party leader of the CDU in the state parliament, a young man of 40 years. And he, on the coming Sunday, he is trying to defend his position in the state election. So far, if you have any question, please feel free. I'm happy to answer any questions.
No, I think this is a great start, and I think it's interesting with your very first point about some individuals who had their roots in Saarland and were in national politics. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, Heiko Maas, Peter Altmaier. It's interesting to see that they're not all CDU politicians, of course. Heiko Maas, who served as foreign minister and before that justice minister, is a social democrat. Of course, AKK and Peter Altmaier are CDU. So you've got leadership people coming out of Saarland.
And also Oskar Lafontaine, who was he was the national chairman of the newly founded Left.
Yes.
And his wife also, he became later on the leader of the Left in the German federal parliament, in the Bundestag.
And I do want to come back to Oskar Lafontaine and the SPD and Left Party, because I think there's an interesting dynamic going on there, of course. But first, I'd like to ask you how satisfied voters have been with the Große Koalition. You were talking about the Große Koalition, the Grand Coalition, coming largely as a result of economic challenges facing the Saarland. Tobias Hans has been the minister president. His deputy as minister president and economics minister is now his main challenger, Anke Rehlinger from the SPD. So how satisfied have voters been with the leadership of Minister President Hans?
The voters are basically satisfied with the Grand Coalition. The Grand Coalition is the preferred constellation in the polls. Most people say they wish another Grand Coalition after the election. Mm-hmm. Or let me just tell you what the reasons are for this development. First of all, the economic situation or the economic problems and challenges to our state are huge, and in such difficult times, people want to want the major parties to work closely together. This is one important reason for that. But there is another reason for that. In almost all small parties, there is a lot of quarrel and dispute going on. So these small parties don't seem to be very stable when it comes to the formation of a government. And most people don't want these small parties to join the government because they are afraid that this government won't be very stable, right? So you ask me, Stephen, how satisfied are the voters with the Prime Minister, Tobias Hans? And this is very interesting because the polls show they are not very satisfied. They are satisfied with the work of the Grand Coalition, but they are not very satisfied with the Prime Minister. This is interesting. If the people could elect the Prime Minister directly, the vast majority of the people in the Saarland would vote for his challenger, Anke Rehlinger, who has been a deputy Prime Minister for 8 years and also the Minister for Economic Affairs. This is very unusual because incumbents normally have a big advantage in the election, and this is not the case. There are mainly, I would say, there are two reasons for that. First, the Prime Minister is being held responsible for very unpopular measures in the fight against Corona, the Corona disease. That's his own explanation for his lack of popularity, and I think that is true, but it's not the whole truth, I would say. There is a second reason for that, and I would say the second reason is because he has changed his mind right before the election on several important issues, especially in the education policies. And many voters believe the Prime Minister did that, or that was, let's say, not driven by conviction, but it was the attempt to improve his polling numbers. He did that for tactical reasons, not because he was convinced that he's doing the right thing. And I think these two reasons contribute to the fact that most voters want a new Prime Minister.
So maybe one more question, sort of about the general sort of state of affairs in Saarland in the immediate run up to this election. You've talked about a couple of issues. You've talked about sort of economic hardship and economic challenges in the state. You talked about COVID measures and how the public is responding to that. You mentioned education. In some of the reading that I was doing in anticipation of our conversation, I saw that Anke Rehlinger has really been focusing on jobs as one of the main issues in her campaign. What have been the most important topics for voters in the Saarland in the run-up to this election?
Given the difficult economic situation, I would say the three main issues are jobs, jobs, and jobs. Right before the election, as I said, the industry is very important to our state. We had a mining industry, a very strong mining industry until 2012. It was closed down because of the damages it caused to houses and properties, and also because it was very expensive. Now we still have a very strong steel industry with about 13,000 employees and a very strong automobile industry with 44,000. So the Saarland is one of the three most important centers nationwide in terms of the production of cars. And due to regulations in the context of the fight against climate change, these industries, steel and automobile, have to become climate neutral within the next 2 or 3 decades. Mm-hmm. And this is really a huge challenge for our state, especially the change towards electric mobility. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest employers in the Saarland is the Ford company, with about 6,000 employers. And they are considering to close down the factory and concentrate its production in Cologne and Sevilla. So this is a heavy fight here going on to convince the Ford company to not to give up its production site here in the Saarland. Mm-hmm. Of course, you mentioned there are also other issues such as Corona, of course. Education, always a very important issue, because that's a field of policy where decisions are really made on the state level. Mm-hmm. Education, the federal level in Berlin has almost nothing to decide in education. That's an issue that is regulated on the state level. So this is always a very important issue in state elections, right? Mm-hmm. And things like traffic, public transportation, traffic. That's always important. But the overall dominating issue is really the economic situation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talk about some of the challenges facing the state of Saarland and how that's playing out in politics. One of our viewers made a comment and posed a question in the Q&A, and she said that you commented that in difficult times, people really want the major parties to work together, and that here in the US, we're actually seeing greater polarization and less collaboration. And this seems to be very different in Saarland. And that's a really good segue to talk a little bit about some of the latest polling numbers that I saw. Today, I saw a ZDF Politbarometer poll that showed the Social Democrats moving from 39% to 41%, giving them a 13-point lead over the Christian Democrats, who went from 30% to 28%. The Greens and the Free Democrats are both sort of hovering at about 5%, which makes it, a little bit of a stretch as to whether they'll even be represented in the state parliament. And then, of course, the AFD are at about 6.5%, depending on the poll that one looks at. And the left party that you were talking about before hasn't even made the 5% hurdle. It's polling at 4% right now. So as you sort of look at these numbers, I guess, one question that I would have for you from our viewers is why we're not seeing the same kind of polarization in the Saarland that we've seen elsewhere. But I also saw that today you had an interview with the head of Infratest DIMAP on the election in Saarland, and they had done some polling. So I'd love to get your take on sort of the current polling numbers.
It's very interesting you mentioned, or the viewer mentioned, the polarization of the party system, right? This is very strong in the United States. And it's especially strong when it comes to cultural issues, right? Same-sex marriage, abortion like this, migration, right? And we don't have that in Germany on the federal level. We do have polarization, but we do have the polarization not between the two big people's parties, that is to say, SPD on center-left and CDU on the moderate conservative center-right side, but we have this polarization between the Greens on the left side and the right-wing populist party AFD on the other side. That's a big difference, and especially on the state level, there is not much ideological difference between CDU and SPD. They have similar approaches when it comes to saving the industry, there is not much difference. And the CDU in the Saarland is very moderate. They really are at the center of the party system. They are in contrast to some organizations within the CDU that have right wings. That's not the case in the Saarland. So this is a very center-oriented party, right? And this applies also to the SPD in the Saarland. And that's because the Saarland has no money. You can't do anything. So this leads to the fact that the parties, there is not much difference, because there's not much money you can spend for ideological projects. You know, you have to do what is necessary so that the state can survive.
Mm-hmm.
That's really a big difference, especially to the situation in the US also. Mm-hmm. We don't have this cultural war. We don't have it in Germany to the extent in the US, and we don't have it in the Saarland. The Saarland is less polarized than Germany at all.
As a whole.
As a whole, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems that way when you look at the polling numbers, and that, you know, the Social Democrats and the CDU together really have between 70 and 80% of the votes.
And that's in historical perspective. They even had some decades ago at the state election 1999, mm-hmm. They had together 90% of the votes.
Wow.
90%. Wow. This is and that is the reason for that is that in historical perspective we had two big sociological groups in Saarland, which are very strong. On the one hand, we had that Catholic group, which voted traditionally for the CDU. On the other hand, we had that group of labor union members and workers, steel workers, that voted for the SPD.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is traditional. We hadn't that for example, the peace movement or this environmental protection movement was never that strong like in other mm-hmm. states. Mm-hmm. But we had these two big groups, the Catholics and the workers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And each of this group had its own party, so to speak.
And so it really, you know, I think there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the future of the Volksparteien, or the catch-all parties, and it seems as if their legacy is lasting longer in Saarland than it has in other parts of the country.
Yeah, that's the case.
One of our viewers is curious whether the war in Ukraine is having an impact on the state election in Saarland, and whether the topic of refugees coming to Germany in the whole, but coming to Saarland, is a topic that people are thinking about in the context of this election on Sunday.
That's an interesting question, but I would say the war in Ukraine doesn't play any major role, because the main parties at the center of the party system doesn't differ in its position towards the war. All parties from the Greens till the Free Democrats are in favor of giving weapons to Ukraine. All are in favor of helping refugees. And even the anti-migration party, AfD, the right-wing anti-migration party, Alternative for Germany, AfD, is in favor of hosting refugees. Mm-hmm. So there is not much difference in the election campaign. the consequences of the Ukrainian war played a certain role when it came to the higher fuel prices.
Mm-hmm.
That was a major attempt by the incumbent prime minister to, let's say, to force the federal government to reduce taxes on fuel. That was his main campaign issue in the recent days. But there is not much difference between the parties on the main issues related to the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So Daniel, I'd like to maybe spend a few minutes talking a little bit more about the Social Democrats, about the SPD, because there is really the potential for an upset by the SPD after 22 years of government by the CDU. And I'm curious whether the lead in the polls can be explained by what's going on at the state level, at the local level in Saarland, or whether it also has to do with national politics and the fact that the Social Democrats are leading the government at the federal level. And part of the reason why I'm asking this is because in one of the articles that I read about the election, it described Anke Rehlinger's campaign as not being particularly creative or impressive in any way. And yet the Social Democrats are polling way ahead of the Christian Democrats, and Rehlinger is polling ahead of Tobias Hans, were there to be a direct vote of the minister president. So I guess the question is, does this have more to do with the failings of Tobias Hans, or more with the success of Anke Rehlinger, or are there other factors at play?
Well, your first question was whether this is the result of national politics or politics on the state level, right? I would say this is actually it's both. On the one hand, the national level, on the national level, the SPD is stable at about 25% in the polls, which is very good for the Social Democrats, because in recent years they had about 15%. So 25% is the result of the federal election in last September, and this is good. This is good. On the state level, the SPD and Anke Rehlinger are simply more popular than the CDU. Rehlinger has very good polling numbers, and this is because of the mistakes of the CDU. They have they don't have a good campaign because they lack of issues that can really mobilize the voters. The SPD had some really good issues in education, jobs, the focus on jobs, as you mentioned. Anke Rehlinger has the main focus of the whole campaign on jobs. That's exactly what people want to hear. And the CDU has also a focus on jobs, but it's not as dominating as with the SPD. And they lack some good mobilizing issues.
I mean, it's been interesting to follow this a little bit, because I don't think that these shifts or transitions have happened in the immediate run up to the election. Looking at some of the polling numbers since mid-November, it looks as if there was really kind of a swing from Hans to Rehlinger. So following the national election at the end of September. But it was also interesting today and yesterday to read that some senior CDU politicians have already written off the election and have seen it as a foregone conclusion that the CDU will lose again by a significant margin to the SPD. Do you think there's any chance that the CDU might fare better than some of those politicians think, and then the polling numbers indicate right now?
You just mentioned that the first polling numbers of November last year, which seemed to indicate a swing. This really is true because there were polls in 2020 which indicate that Tobias Hans and the CDU would win the election by a wide margin. So Hans was at that time, he was quite popular, dominating the polls and leading with 40% for the CDU and 52% for him as a person when the prime minister would be elected directly. And this changed in the last year, at first because of the swing on the national level, and also because more and more people got dissatisfied with the corona management policies by the Grand Coalition. And that was, and he's being held responsible for that, which is normal as a prime minister. Sure. But you asked about the role of the CDU on the national level in this campaign. It's true, as you mentioned, some politicians said that this state election is only about state policy and there's nothing to do with the national level. So this is obviously, these politicians are trying to limit the political damage to the newly elected chairman Friedrich Merz and to the national party caused by the Saarland state election, right? Because there is a big risk. The Saarland is, as you mentioned, is the first of 4 state elections this year. And the risk is that there is a kind of domino effect. If the CDU loses dramatically in the Saarland state election, that could have an impact on I would say, an indirect impact on the state election of North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the most important state election because North Rhine-Westphalia is the biggest state in Germany. And if the CDU would lose the prime minister and the majority in North Rhine-Westphalia and also later on in Schleswig-Holstein, this would be a huge catastrophe for the CDU. And so there is no direct impact on other state elections, but there could be an indirect impact in terms of what this means for what the state election in the Saarland means for the motivation of the campaigners in North Rhine-Westphalia if they lose dramatically here.
So if the Social Democrats win, do you think that there will be a change in the makeup of the governing coalition? Or do you think that it's more likely that there will be a role reversal in the Grand Coalition? Of course, it depends a lot on how the Greens and the FDP do and whether they even pass the 5%. But what do you think the likely new government could look like?
I think that the SPD, which is going to win the election, no doubt about it, that the Social Democrats are going to try to build another Grand Coalition because of 2 reasons. Number one, the problems of the economy, as I mentioned, are big, and as SPD and CDU have similar approaches. The SPD has good connections to the labor union. The CDU has good connections to the employer organizations, and so this might be an argument for another Grand Coalition. Number 2, why I think there is going another Grand Coalition is that the SPD and Anke Rehlinger think it is probably more stable than any other coalition. The alternatives to a grand coalition led by the SPD, or is probably in coalition formed by Social Democrats and Free Democrats, or formed by SPD and Greens, or by SPD, Greens and Free Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
And the Greens are very unstable. They have a lot of quarrel inside the party. And so I think Anke Rehlinger in recent days put emphasis on the fact that it's not only important the ideological aspects, but also the personal trust into persons with whom she would cooperate in the government. And so this is an argument for another grand coalition, because the politicians of CDU and SPD know each other very, very well, and they trust each other. That's I would say that's a fact. But there is one open question, and that is, if the CDU loses dramatically 10 or 15%, no one knows how stable this party is going to be in the next few weeks or months. And yeah, we have to wait. We have to wait for the developments within the CDU after they lose dramatically.
Yeah, and I guess the other question that I have for you that's related to that is what does the future of Tobias Hans look like if the CDU loses? I mean, could you imagine that he would take over as deputy minister president, vice minister president after having served
I would say that's the $1 million question. No one knows. I asked him a couple of days ago, what are you going to do? And he says, we are only making plans for the victory. We have no plan B. But I think he has realized that he has no chance. And I think if the CDU really loses 10%, 15%, he can no longer be the chairman of the CDU on the state level. And it would be absolutely unusual if a prime minister becomes a normal minister.
Yeah,
that's I haven't seen anything like that in Germany, and I think he is probably, I'm not sure, but I could imagine that he is going to leave the political business, but I'm not sure at all.
So Daniel, I'd also like to ask you about the Green Party, because the Green Party, of course, is seeing tremendous success at the national level, but does not seem to be showing the same sort of success in Saarland. The Greens did not meet the 5% threshold 5 years ago in the last state election. Now they're only polling at about 5%. In polls as recently as June of last year, they were at 15% and have sort of come down since then. Why do you think their numbers are so low?
There are mainly two arguments to explain this. Number one, there is a lot of dispute going on in the Greens on the state level. Several groups are fighting for influence and power, and the differences between these groups are rather on a personal level than on ideological differences. You know. And last year, before the national federal elections, they did not even manage to elect a valid candidate list in the Saarland. So they could not be elected in the Saarland. That was very embarrassing for them. And the second reason why the Greens in the Saarland are so weak is related to the economic situation, because issues such as securing jobs and saving the industry and the steel industry are much more important to many voters than, let's say, post-materialistic issues such as climate change and environmental protection. This is a huge difference to some other states in Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, if 40,000 people work in the auto industry, and the Greens are in favor of people getting rid of their cars, that's not a good thing to convince voters in the Saarland.
And let me also ask you about the left party. I mean, you were talking before about the sort of special role of the left party, which many have traditionally thought of as a party that's more dominant in Eastern Germany because of its roots as an outgrowth of the former Communist Party, the PDS, and now the left party, under the leadership of Gregor Gysi and Oskar Lafontaine, Lafontaine, of course, being from the Saarland. But it's very interesting to note that in the last election in 2017, the left party had nearly 13% of the vote. And now they're polling at about 4% of the vote. You had talked about the fact that the left politically was divided between the left party and the Social Democrats. My assumption is that many of those left voters are now voting for the Social Democrats rather than for the left party. But what explains the decline of this left party?
Let me begin in 2009. In 2009, at the state election, the left party got 21%. There was even one poll, I remember that very well. There was one opinion poll that indicated that the left could be stronger than the Social Democrats. And Oskar Lafontaine may become again the Prime Minister of the Saarland. That was a speculation at 2009. Lafontaine was Prime Minister between 1985 and 1998 before he became the finance minister on the federal level for some months. Then he resigned after half a year and left the politics. What explains the decline? At first, Oskar Lafontaine is very popular and he is well known, but this is less and less people know him because he is old. He is almost 80 years old, and someone like me, who I'm 39, or the people who are younger, they don't remember him as a popular prime minister, right? Or he was mayor of the capital, and he was a very popular mayor of the capital of the Saarland, and very successful, by the way. And less people remember his success and his popularity, and only know him from history books. You know what I mean? And that is one reason that explains the decline from 21% down to 13% that you mentioned, 2017. But now we are at 4%. And this has to do with a very, very strong conflict within the left party on the state level. Because Oskar Lafontaine has left the party some days ago. He accused the state organization and the chairman of the left on the state level of manipulating elections within the party and corruption. And that's why the Lafontaine and his environment, they left the party. And there is a second reason, and this relates to the ideological development of the the party on the federal level. Lafontaine and his wife Sarah Wagenknecht, who is also very popular left-wing politician, they accused the leadership of the left party to force the party in the direction of another Green party. That is to say, they accused the left party of putting too much emphasis on climate protection, migration, diversity, and such cultural issues. And they instead are in favor of concentrating on issues such as loans, minimum wages, and such social issues. And that is really a major conflict. And when Lafontaine announced announced to leave the party, he wrote a declaration of 2 pages, and that was his main argument why he's going to leave the party, because the party is moving in a completely false direction to another Green party, and forgetting the normal employees who are fighting for their jobs and looking how they can get their house or their car paid.
Daniel, listening to you talk for the last 45 minutes or so, it seems like a foregone conclusion that the Social Democrats will come out ahead on Sunday. It remains to be seen just how badly the Christian Democrats will do. It remains to be seen how the Greens, the Left Party, the Free Democrats will do. And of course, all of that will then decide what sort of a new government forms. But sort of over the next 48 hours, as you're watching the election campaigning, what are you going to be watching for, and what would you recommend us as interested observers to be looking at over the next few days?
I would recommend to watch the small parties, because I would say the race between SPD and CDU is decided. It's over. There's not going to be much surprise on Sunday. But here's the difference. The small parties, if they fail to get into the parliament because they got less than 5%, the SPD could win an absolute majority, even with 40% of the votes. That's a really interesting question, and that would be sensational, and it would be a huge problem for the CDU, which has been governing this state for 23 years. Interesting. If they were forced into opposition, that would be a major problem for the CDU inside the state, and also for the newly elected leadership on the federal level.
That is truly fascinating. I had not thought about that dimension of it. Of course, you spoke just now about how this could play out on the national level and what sort of signals it could send. You talked a little bit earlier about the symbolism of what could happen in Saarland and what that might mean. But I guess, in closing, my questions to you would be, what, if anything, does a victory for the Social Democrats mean at the national level? And what would this loss for the CDU mean at the national level?
As I said, I would not overestimate the impact of this state election onto the national level. But as I said, there could be an indirect effect in terms of a domino effect on other states, not directly to the national level, but to other to other state elections this year, and above all in North Rhine-Westphalia, because 5 years ago, this is very, very interesting. 5 years ago, we witnessed such a domino effect between the Saarland election and the North Rhine-Westphalia election.
Mhm.
In 2017, the Christian Democrats celebrated a huge and unforeseen victory in the Saarland state election, which was not predicted by the opinion polls. And as a result, the CDU also won in North Rhine-Westphalia some weeks later, and that was the beginning of the end of the then Chancellor candidate Martin Schulz of the SPD, who was leading in the polls. And after his party, the SPD, lost in the Saarland, Schulz was also in strong decline on the national level, and he lost the national elections against the CDU, and that was the starting point. The beginning of this development was made in the Saarland state election.
Well, Danya, I want to thank you so much for spending time to talk with us today, because even though the Saarland is a small state, and even though it does not have a large population, I think this upcoming election can serve as an interesting bellwether for German politics in general. And as you've said, what happens in Saarland could, in some senses, set a precedent for what happens elsewhere. So it's certainly an election that is well worth watching. And I want to thank you again for sharing your insights with us today.
Sure. Thanks for having me. It was an honor to give you some insights into the state politics.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and I wish you all the best for the next few days. I'm sure that you will be incredibly busy. And so I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to us just before the election, and we'll certainly be following things much more closely following the insights that you've shared. So thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.